So Elon Musk did an interview here, and many parts of the interview they talked about politics, and he really just exposed himself as a believer in right-wing economics. So I have a clip here that I'm going to play for you, then I'm going to come back and break down why this is so misleading and wrong.
In general, we should just, if we don't cut government spending, something really bad's going to happen. This is crazy. Our spending is so far in excess of revenue, it's insane. Like you could zero out all billionaires in the country. There's all this like anti-billionaire BS. If you zeroed out all the billionaires, you still wouldn't solve the deficit.
All right, I'll ask you another question around the billionaire BS. Say tomorrow we've talked. You get the phone call from President Biden. Next day, actually, we decide we elect you to Congress. Somehow this happens. You're now working on tax bills. You're working on tax policy. How do you tax someone like you? How do you tax billionaires?
I mean, first of all, I pay a lot of tax. I mean, my marginal tax rate is like 53%. So that's not trivial. And then obviously there's like, asset-based taxes, the sales tax and everything else. There's also the estate tax. I think the estate tax is a good tax. Like if you think of assets beyond a certain level that are far beyond, let's say, somebody's ability to consume, then at a certain point, really what you're doing is capital allocation. So it's not money for personal expenditures. What you're doing is capital allocation, and it does not make sense to take the job of capital allocation away from people who have demonstrated great skill in capital allocation and give it to an entity that has demonstrated very poor skill in capital allocation, which is the government. You can think of the government essentially as a corporation in the limit. The government is simply the biggest corporation with a monopoly on violence.
Okay, let's break this down. There's one part of that is correct and I agree with. It's that the estate tax is good. In a civilized society, it's not a question of are you going to have taxes or are you not going to have any taxes. Of course you're going to have taxes. You need to create a functioning civil society and government. So then the question is, well, how much in taxes and who pays the taxes? And the estate tax is the best answer to that question, which is, what if we taxed rich dead people? And so in other words, you're not going to hand all the money off to the next generation, because then that next generation, total welfare queens, totally entitled, don't have to do anything, and they just get handed everything in life, and everybody agrees that that's ridiculous and makes no sense and is wrong. So he's right about the estate tax. That's the one part that he's right about. Now let's put that aside. He tells a brazen lie in there where he says, I pay a lot of tax. My marginal tax rate is 53%. Hey, dude, ProPublica just did a big breakdown of this not too long ago, and I'll show you your true tax rate. So Elon Musk's true tax rate is 3.27%. So let me break this down for you. In other words, I don't remember which year or years this is over, but it's fairly recently. He made $13.9 billion. There was wealth growth for Elon Musk of $13.9 billion. So that's actually the amount of money that he made. Now, the income he reported, which is separate, that's what he's claiming as this is my income. So in other words, he could keep some of that $13.9 billion in the company still. But he says, I'm going to take an income of $1.52 billion. And then he says, and then the total taxes paid on that is $455 million. So even if you are as kind to him as you can possibly be with your interpretation, then you say, well, he made $1.52 billion. He paid $455 million. That's not 53% in taxes. It's not. Do the math on it. It's not. Okay? But what's called the true tax rate, which is the actual percentage that you pay on the wealth that you earned, it's just 3.27%. Now, it actually gets worse than that. So his true tax rate is 3.27%. Since then, since this came out, this piece, we learned from other reporting that Elon Musk learned about this tax avoidance scheme. He probably has a tax attorney that really looks out for him, where they tell you all the tricks and all the loopholes. He learned about this scheme called buy, borrow, die. Now, the way that works is Elon Musk goes to a bank and says, look, I'm Elon Musk. At one point, literally the richest person in the world. I don't know if he's still number one, but he's certainly in the top 10 or 20. He goes, look, I'm worth billions. I'm worth billions of dollars. So what the bank allows him to do is borrow against his wealth. And then because he's technically not taking any salary or any income when he borrows against his wealth, he doesn't have to pay any taxes. And he has a literal 0% tax rate. That's what he's doing now. So for him to say, I have a 53% marginal tax rate, that's just totally bogus. If Elon Musk paid every penny to the federal government and the state government, probably in California, back when he was in California, and he didn't use any loopholes or any tax attorneys, then maybe he could get to 53%. But he didn't do that, and his actual true tax rate is 3.27%, and now he's not even paying that because he's doing the buy, borrow, die scheme. So look, call it what it is. I don't care how many of you are Elon bros out there. I know he's got a lot of stands out there. He's not telling the truth here. What he's saying is not true. Okay. Now put that aside. Let's get to the rest of the arguments because there's a lot of stuff to break down here as well. He says at the end there, it doesn't make sense to take the job of capital allocation and give it to an entity that's poor at that skill. So he's saying the government is bad at capital allocation. Private business people are good at capital allocation. So why would you have the government do it? And he makes an argument, the government's like a corporation. That is absolutely incorrect. The government's job is not supposed to be like a big corporation. In fact, the government's job, in many respects, is to curb the excesses of corporations. The government's job is to keep those corporations in check. The government's job is to have rules and regulations in place that mitigate what's called externalities from corporations. So in other words, under capitalism, you have this issue that arises where sometimes doing the right thing does not make monetary fiscal sense. So classic example is there's a factory on a river, and they are involved in, the factory does something that creates toxic waste. Now, it will save them money and therefore pad the bottom line and make more profit and help their shareholders more. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to help their shareholders. It will save them money if they just dump all their toxic waste in the river that's right next to the factory. So this is a classic story. This has happened. I believe it was in New York, and I believe it was the Hudson River. That was happening. And then the government had to step in and say, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't do that. You're killing all the wildlife in the river. You're making it toxic. You people, can swim in it and then they get sick. It might get into some drinking water sources and poison people. You can't do that. So now here's a rule. Here's a regulation. You have to pay for the transportation of the toxic waste to a place where you can safely dispose of it. So that's what's called an externality. And then the government steps in and does a regulation which prevents the harm from being done, which looks out for the entire community, the entire good of the entire country. That's the point of government. The point of government, at its best, is to be a constitutional republic in this country and a representative democracy. Constitutional republic means, hey, here are these rules. They're ironclad. They're set in stone. These are your rights. These are inexorable. We don't bend these. So in theory, you're supposed to have a right to free speech. In theory, you're supposed to, have a right to due process and a trial. And so you have all these things. Hey, no cruel, unusual punishment. All these things are your rights. We're going to protect these rights. And on the other hand, representative democracy. So you elect people who then in turn pass rules and regulations and laws that you want them to pass. So you have some democratic say in the way your country is run. This is all literally fundamentally the opposite of what a corporation is. A corporation is, we're here to make money. It's all about the profit, and we have a rigid hierarchy. So you have the owner, then you have the manager underneath the owner, and then what we say goes, and we're going to try to increase productivity. We're going to try to make as much money as possible. And that's the way that works. It's not even close to the same thing. It's fundamentally at odds in many respects, and that's a good thing. You don't want to run the country and the government like a business because you're not in the business of profit at all. This is why the best governments in the world, the functioning social democracies that beat our ass in every measurable way, the governments provide free healthcare and free college and paid vacation time by law. And they make it so life is not just about economics and a capital pursuit. It's not this perverse game that your whole life is. It's the community aspect and the collective aspect and a way to set reasonable rules and standards and foster a society. That is not at all what a corporation is. So that line has always pissed me off because it takes 5 seconds of thought to realize it's not true. Government should act more like a corporation or is like a corporation. And even the idea that, well, the private investors are good at capital allocation, the government's bad at it. Not necessarily. Sometimes, sure. Like, are there some businessmen who are good at capital allocation and, they invest in things that make sense and it helps a community? Sure, that could happen. But it could also happen with the government. The New Deal was great, a great use of capital allocation. You could argue the Marshall Plan, same thing. Now, are there bad examples of what the government does with money? Well, of course, they fucking bailed out Wall Street to the tune of billions of dollars and they waged these endless wars. So there's nothing inherent about government or private capital that makes one good and the other bad. That is a phenomenally unnuanced take for a guy who's supposed to be some sort of mega genius. So, I mean, the ways in which this doesn't make sense, if you can't tell, are astronomical. Astronomical. Then he makes the point earlier in there about all this anti-billionaire nonsense. You can zero out all the billionaires and it won't solve the deficit. Okay, well, first of all, the point of taxing billionaires is not to eliminate the budget deficit. In fact, if you bothered to read anything on economics, whether it's MMT theory, Keynesian theory, or what have you, any modern economic school of thought, what you realize is deficit spending is not inherently bad. And the national debt is something you'll never eliminate. That's, virtually all countries have a national debt, and it's not something that you pay off over time. That's not the way it works. And again, the deficit, when you have times of economic stagnation, you're supposed to run a budget deficit. The government is the spender of last resort to try to give a jumpstart to the economy so that we don't suffer horrendous recessions and depressions every 5 or 10 years. So he just doesn't understand the budget deficit. But even the idea that, you could tax all the billionaires, everything, and it doesn't eliminate the deficit. Well, that's not the point of taxing billionaires. One of the points of taxing billionaires is to limit the worst excesses of capitalism. Because capitalism, left on its own, might make it so that literally one family, the Walton family, 6 people, has more wealth than almost the bottom 50% of the country combined. Seems like a problem, doesn't it? Seems like a problem. So the point is not to solve the budget deficit. The point is, here's the other thing. Extreme wealth is system threatening by its very nature. Why? Because when you have a small group of people with so much money, so much wealth, so much power, so much influence, they effectively can buy the government. And they can use the government for their own purposes, and then the government is no longer representing the will of the people, which is what it's supposed to do. So this is the problem of corruption. This is the problem of money in politics. When you have a small group of corporations and a small group of billionaires that have so much money that they own the country and they run the country, you don't really have a democracy anymore. You don't really have a functioning government anymore. You have a plaything for the mega wealthy. You have what's called a kleptocracy or an oligarchy or a corporatocracy. And that's what we have in this country. So there's an inherent problem with extreme wealth. Now, by the way, you talk to most leftists and they're not saying take all the money from all the billionaires. I mean, maybe some do, but there are various ideas out there. You can max out at like $1 billion in net worth. So everything over $1 billion is effectively taxed at 100%. And you take that money, you allocate it to universal health care, universal education, whatever, things of that nature. Now, he does say it in there at one point, like, yeah, if people have enough money that it far exceeds their ability to consume in a lifetime, like, that's a problem. That's why he said he's in favor of the estate tax. To which I respond, yes, Elon, that's the one thing you said that makes sense. So if people have more wealth than they could ever use to consume in a lifetime, then why do they have that wealth? Maybe that shouldn't be allowed. If you really believe that, then maybe the max out number people should have is like 500 million and not $1 billion. So look, it depends which leftist you talk to, but some will say, cap it 100% tax over $1 billion in net worth. Some would go lower than that. Some would go higher than that. But the fact of the matter is, you absolutely need to curb systemic inequality, whether it's wealth inequality or income inequality, because you create a system that is a joke. You create a system that is of, by, and for the wealthy, of, by, and for the corporations, doesn't serve the needs of the people, and then it's just tick-tock until the whole thing implodes, and that's where we are right now. So he's in this little clip alone, it's a mess. He also attacks Build Back Better in another portion of it, and his arguments suck. And final thing, he says there, if we don't cut government spending, something bad is going to happen. It's insane. So this is Elon Musk, one of the world's richest people. doing the classic fallacy that, like, well, the way the federal government works should be the way a household works, and the way a household balances its budget. They are not the same thing. The dollar is the world reserve currency, and even if it wasn't, we have a sovereign currency that we have control over. It's not the same as a household. It's not at all the same as a household. And so running a budget deficit sometimes is the correct thing to do. So it's just a mess. This whole thing is a mess. And he started talking politics, and he sounded very similar to a confused 14-year-old Ayn Rand fan, and that came across very clearly.